Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Please join me in saluting our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning. Thank you. Roll call, please, Judy.
Mr. Morrow?
Here.
Mr. Harrington?
Here.
Mr. Maryhill?
Here.
Mr. Gardner?
Here.
Mr. Depot?
Here.
Mr. Fairby?
Here.
Mr. Blades?
Here.
Mr. McNally?
Here.
Mr. Skazvava?
Here.
Mr. Cannon?
Here.
Mr. Politi?
Here.
Mr. Moore?
Here.
Mr. Marnell?
Here.
Mr. Whitson?
Here.
Mr. Grinnell?
Here.
Mr. Connell?
Here.
Mr. Gilliland?
Here.
And Mr. Preston?
Here.
Thank you.
Good morning. We have no assigned guests, but we do have the pleasure of having our citizens back here today. Dan, would you like to come up and say a few words? Yeah. Morning, Dan.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm going to try to do my best to come up with your board meetings, not because I think you guys need me meddling in your business. I've been there, done that. I feel for all you guys because I know how difficult it is to run a county. I know that we're coming into the height of budget season, and I've been watching Essex County for a while, so I know that budget time is always a fun time. So, but I'll also be holding some office hours afterwards this afternoon in my office over there, and Joe Pavoncha, your county clerk, invited me to kind of help out at the counter. So it's kind of Essex County Elizabethtown Day today. Last month I was here 10 times, and the Board of Elections says if you live somewhere more than half the time, you're eligible to vote. So if I could have squeezed 5 more days in last month, I'd be able to vote in Essex County. Nothing new really to report since I was here last month. I'm very happy, and I want to thank Mike Mascarenas. He's been bird dogging the Petro Dam issue, and thank you guys all for moving that forward. It looks like we should be, if the weather holds, on track to make that go away. I know you have a public hearing and a healthy discussion that you set last month today, so I'm looking out at the audience in attendance here, and I know almost everybody in the room, so we're making progress. But in any event, if there's any questions, while I'm here, I'm happy to answer them.
Good. Thanks, Dan. Any questions for Dan? Not Dan. Thanks as always. We appreciate your visits and your information you bring to us.
You got it.
Thank you. Okay, Judy. One resolution, please.
Resolution 253, authorizing the administrator of the Workers' Compensation Insurance Plan to accept year 2 of a 3-year contract agreement with PERMA for workers' compensation and employers' liability insurance in the amount of $684,120 for the period January 1st, 2015 through December 31st, 2017, and further authorizing the county chairman and/or county manager to execute the same.
Moved by Mr. Cannon, second. Second, Mr. Maryhill. Got out, voted on. Comments or questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Just a moment. Sorry. Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skazvava?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Politi?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 254, approving the 2016 Essex County self-insurance budget and the workers' compensation town contributions.
Moved by Mr. Cannon. Mr. Morrow. Mr. Connell. Comments or questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Fairby?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skazvava?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Politi?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 255, authorizing the re-levy of unpaid 2015-2016 village and school taxes and all road, water, sewer, and garbage rents on the 2016 tax levy.
Moved by Mr. Whitson. Mr. Gardner.
questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 256, authorizing the purchase of a web filtering device and maintenance contract from the Layer 3 Technologies from New York State Contract PT 65090 in the amount of $10,700.
Moved by Mr. Cannon. Second. Mr. Skozavala. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yeah.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Oops, I think I skipped one. Oh, no, didn't. Resolution 258, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Moved by Mr. Maryhill, second. Skip one?
Did I skip one? I thought I did.
57.
I'm sorry. Resolution 257, authorizing an upgrade to Penimation software to provide employees access to the leave and benefits program in an amount not to exceed $15,000 with funds to come from Information Systems Capital Project.
Moved by Mr. Moore, second Mr. Maryhill. Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Moore. Maryhill. Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. 258. Okay. Resolution 258, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Mr. Moore, moved by Mr. Moore, second. Mr. Connell. Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 259, authorizing appointments to boards, committees, and/or councils.
Moved by Mr. Blades, have a second. Mr. Gilliland. Mr. Brunel, I'm sorry. Comments or questions? If not, all in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Resolution 260 of appreciation to Meg Parker, Outreach Coordinator for the Creating Healthy Places Grant to Live, Work, and Play.
Moved by Mr. Preston. Thank you.
Resolution 261, adopting and approving quality improvement reviews and policies procedures for the Certified Home Health Agency and preventive services approved by the PAC.
Moved by Mr. Blades. Second. Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yeah.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 262, authorizing the Public Health Department to apply for and accept a grant from the New York State Department of Health for 2016 car seat program in the amount of $7,550 and further authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute the same.
Moved by Mr. Blades, second by Mr. Connell. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 263, authorizing the county chairman or county manager to enter into an agreement on behalf of Essex County with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services for the 2015 Comprehensive Plan for Youth Development Program funding as provided for in the 2015 Essex County budget.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? Mr. Scott.
Just, how are these amounts arrived at?
What's that?
How they vary for different towns?
Courtesy of floor, Mr. Mascarenas.
So moved.
12 to allow Mr. Mascarenas.
Yes, you do.
We aren't getting enough now.
I can see that. Yeah. It certainly isn't based on population.
There's $50,000 that were allocated this year to our resource allocation package from Office of Children and Family Services. The numbers you see there are population driven from the state of New York. They give you so much for each child and allocated locally. We do that at our youth meeting that we don't get quite a lot of attention from. Mrs. Wilkins is well aware of which, so it's approved by our youth board and then brought to the board.
So if they're driven by population, I don't understand how...
Children in the program.
Yes, youth per county, essentially. We have about 9,000 young people under the age of 18 in our county. They then have a formula driven that we get. It's not necessarily reallocated to each community through population.
Right, so my question is, how are the amounts arrived at? Like Mariah, 500, and 1,900 for Elizabethtown Lewis. How do you come up with that number?
What you're seeing there are different funding streams that have been put together. You're looking at recreation only. Like if you look down that chart, you can see Mariah is significantly higher in other areas of service. Money as well as youth development money, there's two different things. So for instance, Town of Elizabethtown's getting all their money, they're allocated for one specific service, where you're just spread out several. So you're not getting any less money than Elizabethtown, you're just locally, you're deciding to run your license and not necessarily your revenue.
Thank you.
Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 264, accepting, adopting, and placing on file policies, plans, procedures, and annual reports.
Moved by Mr. Connell, second, Mr. Morrow. Mr. Mornell, comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
Carried.
Resolution 265, accepting grant funds from the New York State Archives Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund for the Office of the Essex County Clerk for the imaging of tax rolls dated 1974 through 2008 in the amount of $25,276, and further authorizing the county chairman or county manager to execute a contract for the same.
Moved by Mr. Maryhill, second by Mr. Blades. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 266, authorizing the Office for the Aging Department to hire an employee for the period November 1st, 2015 through December 31st, 2016, with the cost to be covered by a BIP grant.
Moved by Mr. Blades, have a second. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Marnell, comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution number 267, authorizing a contract amendment to the Murray Law Firm contract to increase contract by $25,000.
Moved by Mr. Cannon, second by Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon? Mr. Palooty?
No.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution carries. Resolution 268, authorizing the Emergency Services Department to go forward with the drop-in site with the town of Willsboro relative to paging with costs associated thereof not to exceed $10,000.
Moved by Mr. Gilliland. Second. By Mr. Preston. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolutions from the floor. Just go ahead and read them. First one is adopting proposed local law number 3 of 2015, amending local law number 2 of 2014, entitled Essex County Room Occupancy Tax Law, to clarify the definition of hotel or motel.
Moved by Mr. Preston. Second, Mr. Morrow. Excuse me, these 12 get it on the floor, please.
Yes, you do.
Mr. Morrow, comments or questions? Mr. Skozavala.
Is the 2-week grace period in this law? Yes or no? No? No. Does that conflict with the IRS laws in saying that that you can rent your properties for?
This isn't an IRS law, this is our particular law, so we don't have to abide by the IRS law.
I understand that, but I thought we had discussion that we were going to include that, no?
If I may. Sure. I think we went back and forth, and ultimately, I think we decided that we were going to treat everybody the same, and that we weren't going to address that exemption, so to speak.
Any other comment or question? Not roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
No.
Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Next one from the floor is authorizing an expenditure of a minimum of $2,500 to all towns, and an additional sum of a minimum of $50,000 to the Essex County Fish Hatchery in the event that revenues received from the Essex County room occupancy tax as they relate to vacation rentals exceeds $350,000, and further authorizing an amendment of the current contract with the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism, Lake Placid Convention and Visitors Bureau to provide these monies to the town and fish hatchery.
12 law on the floor.
I'm going to bring that up.
think so. Get your hand up. Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Preston. Second. Second by Mr. Conley. Mr. Lewis. Comments or questions? Mr. Scott.
I'm just reading the language here. So is this specific to, these revenues are not going to come in unless we generate at least $350,000 additional just through vacation rentals? That's the way it says it.
Would you like to ask Mr. McKenna? 12, allow Mr. McKenna to come to the floor, please.
Yes, you do.
Jim, come on down.
There was
Please.
a couple floating.
There may be a couple of questions, so. Morning, Jim.
Morning.
What's the question?
The way the resolution is written, it says the Essex County room occupancy tax as they relate to vacation rentals exceeds $350,000. So my question is that are we dependent upon vacation rentals coming in at $350,000 or more before we receive the $2,500?
I think it was 250.
Yeah, it was originally 250, and then the second paragraph is 350,
And then it increases after 350.
So I mean, it was never my understanding that this was going to be tied into just vacation rentals. It was my understanding if the occupancy tax exceeded the $250,000, then we get the money. So where did this language change come from, that it's got to be dependent upon vacation rentals only? Because if I'd have known that, I would have never supported that local law that was prior to this.
that's the way I took it. That's the way it appeared in a memo I was given. If I'm wrong, we certainly can change it to, if it exceeds $250,000 over the overall collected hotel motel tax, then so be it. But I took it as $250,000 as generated over that as generated by the vacation rentals only. So the question is for Jim, not me.
That's the way that I recall it too.
The question is for this board, because we'll ultimately determine what it's based on, not Jim.
Well, I'm just saying Jim gave the report. I was interpreting it. The question is for the board, of course.
I'm going to move an amendment to it, if I may.
Move amendment.
Second on the amendment.
Second on the amendment. Mr. Cologne? Discussion. Open for discussion.
What's the amendment?
What is the amendment you're voting on? That if the occupancy tax exceeds $250,000 overall, that we receive the $50,000 for the fish hatchery and the $2,500 per each community.
No, but $250,000 probably over.
$250,000 not dependent upon just vacation rentals.
So you're asking once the occupancy tax exceeds $250,000
Yes.
over the existing
Over the existing or counting the existing? I mean, your existing occupancy tax.
Well, what is this based on?
What is it?
What is this supposed to exceed here?
This was supposed to be based upon $250,000 of the new occupancy tax.
So $250,000 over what we had.
It's already exceeded that. We collect $2 million a year.
Well, good, then cut me a check.
So basically what you're saying is that the $2,500 and the $50,000 is based upon current receipts, which
Correct.
means you wouldn't have had to have the extra tax to gain it anyways.
Correct.
Mr. Cannon.
This issue's been bouncing around for quite a while, many years since I've been here. And it sounds like Mr. Scott's promise found a way to get that money coming back at us in spite of many years of this thing being not approved. And it sounds like, I guess, Jim, you got an extra $2,500 for 18 towns?
Well, I think that the way that we looked at it was monitoring the vacation rentals allow us, as it exceeds a certain level, it was built on a percentage, so that number of $2,500 would increase as that vacation rental increases. That's the way we sort of developed it, so it wasn't a stagnant number. And I think that's the way, that's why we want to sort of watch, we can definitely track that, and so that it has a growth potential with it.
I think Tom's question is that the $2,500, Tom is wanting the $2,500 to be dispersed out of the occupancy tax that you're currently collecting.
your thing regardless. We're reading this to say that the $2,500 will not be dispersed until the occupancy on vacation rentals exceeds $250,000. So you're going to track it two separate ways.
Yeah, we're tracking two separate ways. The concept was that it would be, once that tax was implemented, or the vacation rental definition was clarified, which I think we've done, then that would be the pool that first, I mean, the minimum of 2,500 comments, we talked, I think, originally. Coming out of that, once it reaches a certain level, I think the number, and I don't have that in front of me, but it was 13%. So if it gets up over 300,000 or more, it reverts back to a percentage.
Mr. Cannon.
Well, in fairness to Jim, I mean, I remember it the way you remember it, the way our attorney remembered it. I think this is a little turn of events that I might be able to support as it goes down the road here.
Mr. Scott,
Well, I certainly don't remember it that way. You know, right now, when you exceed the occupancy tax, you keep it, doesn't go anywhere, correct?
Yep.
And we've exceeded it for, you know, I don't know how many years now, but it was my understanding that there was no fine line or number on this thing, that if we implemented the occupancy tax on the vacation rentals, that we would get $2,500 per community and then $50,000 towards the fish hatchery.
That's correct.
Well, now we're dissecting this thing that clearly states in this resolution that's on the floor, if the vacation rentals exceed $350,000, which tells me that if vacation rentals come in at $300,000, you can hang your hat on the fact we didn't hit the 350, so we don't have to give you anything.
That's wrong.
Well, it's wrong. Read the resolution. That's what the resolution states.
That's what it does say. If it's intended that you get that money out.
How can you say it's wrong?
I think Tom's right on that. I think Tom's right on that.
Correct, I could read.
And actually, the amount's $250, not $350. $250 to start with.
I think, Tom, the original way that I understood it was that once the definitions were implemented, that would trigger, as you said, and we estimated, the 250 came in, because that's what we estimated it was. That's where the 250. So yes, you're right.
I see 250 down the third whereas, but the resolution itself states 350.
Mr. Bleedy, did you have something?
Well, no, I was going to say, we never discussed 250 or 350. There was never a discussion on that. However, the payments were a sweetener on the vacation rental side. That was always the case. But I don't remember any number ever being discussed. I assume it was an estimate. Yeah, because you could only do an estimate. That's the only way to do it.
I have not seen this resolution, Tom. I think you're right. Once it's done, it triggers.
Mr. Preston.
Well, as I had mentioned to you, and then I thought I was crazy, and now I'm not crazy again, the way it was written, the initial paragraph is confusing. When you read the actual, what's in the meat of it down below, it does explain, and that's what was taught from day one, that if it hits 250, every town gets the 2,500. And the fish hatchery gets 50. If it hits 350, then it's based on a percentage. Everything is going to go up.
But I think the cloudiness is the fact that it's based on the vacation rental itself actually accepting or receiving the ticket, not starting at the base number of what the occupancy tax is.
On the vacation rental, and Tommy, I can assure you, you have nothing to worry about. It's going to hit that 250, just like that.
So is everybody clear?
Wilmington's going to give you that.
Wilmington's doing what
I don't really need an amendment. Anything else for Jim? So are we moving to accept the resolution as it's presented?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. 350 needs to be changed to 250. Right, 350 needs to be changed to 250. The rest of the resolution. My understanding is 350.
And get the vacation rental line item out of there. 250,000 exceeded over the prior year, whatever number you're working with now, Dan.
That's not what Jim said, that was it. It's not the way I understood it either. Jim, you want to come on back up?
The only reason 250 was there is because that's the estimate we did. The intent was, at least when we met with the
each town will still get their $2,500. I think that's where, we're not.
No.
This reads.
Not the way
Right, but I think that's where we're understanding that it's.
I don't have any disagreement with 250,000 additional in occupancy tax. My issue is with that number specifically being tied into vacation rentals. That's my issue with this.
Again, as Jim said, I think that was just an estimated cost. Mr. Marnell?
Why don't we take the estimate right out of it? We just send the $2,500 each down. If we get 350, all the better. If we get 100,000,
So take the minimum amount.
you lose a little bit out and Roost will lose some. Don't question that. It's an estimate. Now, estimates are estimates.
The reason for tracking it is 10 years from now, if that number does increase, then there was a mechanism built in on a percentage, not a set number.
Mr. Harrington?
It occurs to me that if you were going to provide $2,500 to each town and $50,000 to the fish hatchery, you don't need $95,000.
That's true. But that's not why we got the... I was given a sheet, and I used that sheet to draw this resolution. So if the information is incorrect, so be it. I think our options are these. $2,500 and $50,000 to the fish hatchery. The question is it if the... is there going to be a threshold, or are you just going to do it? Number one, no threshold. Number two, if it's based on some $250,000 threshold that must be met, is that threshold the threshold of the overall occupancy tax, or the threshold above which just vacation rentals bring in? And I think those are your two options, right? One on the overall tax, or are we not paying any attention to 250? Don't pay attention to that?
The way 250 only came to be because we estimated what it was.
So then we break it down to, is it on, do those payments become due based on the overall, not based on vacation rental amount, did they just become due? All right, well then we can just amend it.
Mr. Galone?
Yes, I agree. I seconded Mr. Casafa's resolution there in order to take out the specificity of the $250,000 being to vacation rentals. I do like Mr. McKenna's idea that there's a second floor of $350,000 where it shifts to a percentage basis, so that's good. So we either take out vacation rentals at the $250,000, or we just take out a floor altogether, and so the minute we pass this, each tenant will have $2,500.
Mr. Cannon?
If we're going to do that, it's in return for this additional tax that we're going to pass here, we all get $2,500, and obviously the total tax that as was pointed out, is $2 million. So to put that into a resolution if it exceeds $250,000 is foolish, in my opinion.
So
If you're going to base it on just the tax receipt.
we could modify the resolution to read...
I don't think you even need that threshold if you're going to give it, this is a quid pro quo is what this is. Get right down to it.
So let's amend it to a resolution authorizing expenditure of a minimum of $2,500 to all towns and the additional sum of a minimum of $50,000 to the Essex County Fish Hatchery, and further authorizing an amendment of the current contract with the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism / Lake Placid Convention and Visitors Bureau to provide these monies to the town and fish hatchery.
I think you can leave the 350 in there as a...
We'll leave that in the body as a escalator.
Yes.
That the funds received by the towns will increase.
Exactly. Yeah.
So why don't we withdraw this motion?
I'll withdraw the amendment.
Withdraw the motion. And a second.
Second. Ms. Galone? All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Okay.
Now, the resolution as
stated will, now a new resolution in its place will state, resolution authorizing an expenditure of a minimum of $2,500 to all towns and the additional sum of a minimum of $50,000 to the Essex County Fish Hatchery, and further authorizing an amendment to the current contract with the Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism / Lake Placid Convention and Visitors Bureau, Roost, to provide these monies to the town and fish hatchery.
Someone like to move that? Somebody wants to second? Mary,
If you do that without having that, we've just shot shot ourselves in the foot.
No, the 300,000 would still stay in there. The 350,000, what you would do is just, under the original whereas would still be there in the event the amount exceeds.
The event of what, though? We've taken out the vacation rental language.
All you've taken out is in the event the revenue received from the room occupancy tax related to the vacation rental exceeds 250. I don't think that changes the 350 at the bottom.
Okay, I just want to be clear on that, because if it does, we've shot ourselves in the foot.
Right, you are. But I think if by leaving in the event the estimated revenues exceed 350,000, because you got one line here that says that whereas it's estimated it's going to reach 250,000, and then you have a sentence or a paragraph in there that says that in the event it exceeds 350,000, you would be subject to the 13%.
We had a mover for that? Tom? We had a second for
Mary Hill? Oh. That was Mr. Mary Hill, sorry.
I think it was both, actually.
Oh,
Are we going to use Mary Hill for the moment?
Mary Hill, well, yep.
okay.
Any further discussion? Comments or questions? If none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore? Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Just a question before we go. Dispersing the funds. January 1st?
No, cash flow these things is always, it's going to probably be this time of the year because the way those rentals come in, and all, our cash flow is only good in September and October, so it's going to be the last part of the year.
Okay. Any other questions for Jim? Thanks, Jim.
The next resolution from the floor, introducing proposed local law number 4 of 2015, continuing the imposition of the additional mortgage tax in Essex County.
Moved by Mr. Grinnell, second by Mr. Maryhill. Comments or questions?
Just for your information, every 3 or 4 years, we have to reintroduce these local laws in order for us to be able to collect our mortgage tax. That's what we're doing. This will allow us to continue to collect mortgage tax until December 1st, 2018.
And this is setting a public hearing then, right?
Yes, it's also setting a public hearing for the 19th of October at 9:15. That's before our heavy committee day.
Further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. The next resolution from the floor, increasing taxes on sales and uses of tangible personal property and of certain services, on occupancy of hotel rooms, and on amusement charges pursuant to Article 29 of the tax law of the state of New York.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by. The mover, Mr. Cannon. Second. Tomorrow. Comments or questions?
Yeah, this is, again, this is another extender. This resolution is required. It's different than the other. The other was a local law, but because this was passed in 1967, this is by resolution. This allows us to continue to collect sales tax until November 30th of 2017.
Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington, I'm sorry. Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner? Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries.
I just want to make one other comment. Somebody Mistecca's in the audience. On both of these bills, primarily on one of them, we needed to have it done 90 days before the expiration, which would have been November. However, the governor was a little overworked probably and didn't get to sign these. Mr. Dan Steck's office was very instrumental in helping to push this stuff through. We couldn't wait much longer, so I'd like to give credit to Dan and his staff for both of those very important extenders, our mortgage tax and our sales tax.
Thank you, Dan, and your staff.
The last resolution I have from the floor is introducing proposed local law number 5 of 2015 entitled "A Local Law to Override the Tax Levy Limit Established in General Municipal Law 3C."
Moved by 12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Cannon, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions?
Is this one also set in a public
None.
hearing?
Roll call vote, please.
We'll have to set a public hearing in this one also.
Yes. Why don't we use the same day at 9 o'clock?
Oh, we can. All right. So we're setting a public hearing for this local law on October 19th at 9 o'clock. It says 9:15, but we'll do 9.
Roll call vote.
Okay. Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades? Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon?
Yes.
Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Mr. Skozavala.
Do we need to set a hearing date for the budget for this month, or is that in next month?
December.
We still have time. We have till December 20th.
Okay.
We still got, we've got some budget hearings today and tomorrow, and then after they're done,
So we can do it in November, we can set the date.
sometime in November.
Any further resolutions from the floor? Mr. Morrow.
I have two of them, Mr. Chairman. Like permission to move a resolution to approve a change order in the amount of $24,200 for Adirondack Concrete to replace the Maybe Bridge and grade the road for the Bartlett Road Bridge. And project is in the town of Keene. Essex County will provide materials for installation and gravel for the road.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do. Jerry?
Morrow, second. Mr. Gilliland. Mr. Grinnell. Get them both in there. Comments or questions? Mr. Morrow.
Just in case anybody's wondering, the money will come from the CHIPS funds.
Any further comments or questions? Not roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee? Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally? Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon? Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Mr. Morrow.
Since we moved that one, this resolution, if I can get permission to extend the contract with DPW-15-0082 with Adirondack Concrete till 10/31/15, this month 31.
12 allowed on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon? Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Further resolutions from the floor, Mr. Blades.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move a resolution of condolences to the family of Iona Dubé. She recently passed. Her son was a longtime councilman in Lewis, and her husband, many years ago, was also a justice and councilman when they were permitted to conduct the same office.
So 12 law on the floor?
Yes, you do.
Unanimous second? Second. Mr. Pleady?
We do the same for former supervisors.
We did it.
We haven't done one.
Yeah, we've been...
Are you moving that?
Mr. Pleady's moving that 12 law on the floor.
Yes.
Second?
Yep.
Second. Do you have something, Mr. Preston? No. No. Anyone else, any other resolutions? If not, I am going to be putting together a subcommittee for the fish hatchery, and my choice of my subcommittee will be Mr. Harrington, will chair the committee, Mr. Preston, Mr. Gardner, Mr. Moore, Mr. Yarrow, and Mr. Dugan. And we'll have Judy send out a memo for that. These gentlemen were on a tour that we did probably 3 or 4 months ago, and we'd like to get back out there and look at some of the concerns that we have. Anything else? If not, pictures, group photo out at the center planter in a few minutes. Mr. Marnell.
Yeah, next question. Does the county have a prior notice law?
Yes.
They do have.
Absolutely.
See, I had an accident on the docks, and the adjuster asked if we had a prior notice law. We do not have one. I know we have a prior notice law, state law, but the county has one.
Towns do too.
Is the towns included?
Yes.
They are.
You should, when you get prior notice from anyone, you should immediately send it off to your insurance company, and you should put it in a separate binder entitled Notice of Prior Written Notice. You should have a local law also that sets forth prior written notice requirements, which have changed a little bit by statute. But back in the 70s, I think,
And all towns at that time?
yes.
Okay.
Sean, did you have something? No? Any further business to come before the committee? If not, we're adjourned. Thank you.